Hello everybody, and welcome to the fifth video in a series that corresponds to class on April 28th of 2020. Alright, so when we left off we had covered some basic research designs. We went over the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment, and now we're going to actually get into the in-class exercise. So as I mentioned at the end of the previous video, what I'd like you to do now is to pull up your weighted displacement quotient calculator that's available to you on Blackboard. And I just want to walk you through this pretty briefly. So as I mentioned, were this something we were doing in class, I would actually go through the mathematical logic that underlies this, but because it does tend to be a bit tricky, and because this calculator automatically calculates what we want anyway, I'm going to set that aside. And how I have this certificate program set up is that we go into this into much more detail in the second part of this course. So in Crime Mapping and Crime Analysis 2, you actually complete an assignment that takes you from start to finish to evaluate a policing intervention. And when I say start to finish, what you'll see when you open up the data is that I've already aggregated data for you, and I've given you counts of crimes in different sectors or beats, and I've already labeled those as treatment and control locations. In the next part of this class, or the second part of this class, what you'll actually be doing is using geographic methods to count the number of crimes that are occurring in different hotspots. So we will get into the weighted displacement quotient a bit deeper in part 2 of this class, but for now I just want to go over the basics of this calculator. Specifically, what I want to go over is the information that you need in order to calculate the weighted displacement quotient. So what you should see here is that what we need is crime counts from 3 different areas for 2 different time periods. And so we need counts of crime in a target area. So this would be a treatment area. This is where the intervention is taking place. We need crime counts in the buffer area, right, that 2-block area outside of the beats that officers were working in. And then we also need counts of crime in a control area. So this would be areas that officers are not working in, and we're going to use these to make comparisons between changes in crime in the targeted areas to see whether our intervention worked or not. And so you'll need these counts for 2 different time periods, both before the intervention was put into place and while the intervention was in operation. Now, it could also be that we do something like problem-oriented policing, and we would expect crime to go down after the intervention was put in place. And if that's true, then we would want counts of crime not during the operation, but after the operation. But we'll set that aside for now. All right, so in terms of what you should take away from this right now is I need counts of crime in these 3 areas, both before the intervention and during the intervention. So how this calculator works is you could just simply input your figures. So here we're looking at an example from Operation Safe Streets, and in the areas where officers were working there were 200 crimes before the operation, 190 crimes during in the areas that were targeted. There were 402 crimes in the control areas before the operation, and then 398 in the control areas during the operation. And we also see a slight increase in the buffer areas. And so if we were to use this example, and this is already inputted for you, if we were to use this example and we wanted to see our results, all we would have to do is click this results tab. Right, so we've got 3 tabs. We started off on the instructions tab, and this is where we're entering our information. Then we can click our results tab once the information is all entered, and we'll get information about what happened during our intervention. So I'll walk you through this. So this first part here gives you the overview of crime trends. So what we're seeing here is that reported crime in the targeted areas decreased by 2.5%. Reported crime in the buffer area increased by 2.76%. And reported crime in the control area decreased by less than 1%. So this just gives you kind of a general overview. Then in part B, we look at the geospatial trends, and here we're looking at a success measure Not important right now to understand what that success measure means, but it's negative 0.008. Because this is negative, what we could say is that crime in the target area was down and it performed better than the control area. So when we're just looking at the amount of crime in the areas that were targeted compared to the areas that were not, right, our comparison locations, well, what this is saying is that crime in the places where officers worked, it went down. And it went down more than the amount of crime decrease that we saw in the control area. So just looking at this section B, what we're getting is that it does appear that we have some sort of benefit. If we look at part C here, we start looking at that displacement effect. And again, remember, displacement is this idea that crime's just going to move around the corner if we target one geographic location. Again, we're going to set aside the buffer displacement measure and weighted displacement quotient for now, right? Because we can use a table to interpret these, but really what we're interested in mostly is did displacement occur, and if it did it completely wipe out our effect? And we get that in these last two rows here. It kind of explains what's occurring here with these numbers. So here we're seeing that the rate of crime displaced to the buffer area was greater than the crime reduced in the targeted area. And so what that means that there was more displacement than there was a direct effect. Or in other words, crime went down a little bit in the areas that officers were working compared to the control areas, but crime went up more in the buffer displacement areas. So what that means is that the effect of our intervention was completely wiped out. We did not have a positive effect here. All right. I'm also going to set aside these statistical outputs for now because, again, we'll get into these in the second part of this class, but we'll set these aside for now. Because really what we can do is just look at our summary and it's going to tell us what happened with our intervention. That's the beauty of this calculator. You don't have to know the underlying logic or mathematical logic. So in the summary, it says that crime in the targeted area was down and it performed better than our control area. Total crime in the combined buffer and target areas decreased by 0.3%. So what this means is that the total net effect was an increase of 2 crimes. In other words, gains in the target area were lost overall. So again, we do not have a successful intervention here. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go return to the instructions tab and I'm going to input some new numbers. Right, I'll keep this target area before the intervention the same at 200. Going to change the during the intervention to 100. Then I'm going to work in the control area. I'll change this to 400 just to keep it neat. And I'm going to change this to 500. And then in the buffer areas, I'll keep this at 145 and I'll change this to 155. Alright, so I just changed the parameters here. I changed what actually happened. So we're actually seeing more of a decrease in the targeted area given what I changed. We're seeing an increase in the control area as well as an increase in the buffer area. But when we go to our results tab, we'll see that things are actually a little bit different. And so if we look at our overview, what we'll see is that reported crime in the targeted area decreased by 50%. In the control area, it increased by 25%. And we do have some displacement here. We see about a 7% increase in crime in the buffer area, which is indicative of displacement. If we look at the geospatial trends, setting aside the success measure, what we learn is that crime in the target area was down and it performed better than the control area. So there was a real reduction in crime that outperformed what happened in the control area. If we look at the displacement area, what we'll see is that the buffer area improved relatively, but not as much as the target area. So what this means is that taking into account what happened in the comparison areas where we saw there was a 100 crime increase, crime in the buffer locations reduced as well. So although crime went up from before to during the intervention in the buffer areas, when we consider how much crime went up in the control areas, we actually see that the buffer area improved relative to the control area. And so what we can say here is that there was no crime displacement. Rather, there was what's referred to as a diffusion of crime control benefits. And I believe I touched on this previously, but a diffusion of crime control benefits is essentially the opposite of displacement. This is where we don't see crime increase in the areas nearby. We actually see crime decrease in the areas nearby, even though officers were not working in the buffer areas. And so this diffusion is actually something we see more often than a displacement of crime when we look at all hotspot interventions, at least. And so that's what we're seeing here. So we're not seeing displacement, we're seeing improvement overall. Right, we'll skip the statistical outputs and we'll again just go to our summary, which tells us that crime in the target area was down and it performed better than the control area. Total crime in the combined buffer and target areas decreased by 26.1%. The total net effect was the prevention of 176 crimes, and there was a positive benefit of the operation overall. Right, so of course the results are going to depend on what we put in to the calculator. So again, we're going to end the video here in about a minute or two, and we'll start working with the actual data that I provided you. I just want to point out one more time that what we're going to be doing in this exercise is we're going to be finding the counts of crime for each of these areas during both of these time periods. And then we'll return to our weighted displacement calculator and see what actually happened with our hypothetical intervention. All right, so I will see you in the, what video is this now, 5? I'll see you in the next video, which I believe is 6. And before I go, I'm just going to give you your 4th quiz question. And for this quiz question, what I'd like you to do is tell me what a total net effect is. And so, going back to your results tab, total net effect is the prevention of 176 crimes in this particular example. So what this is saying is that the total net effect tells us by how much crime went up or down in targeted areas relative to controls. All right, that's your quiz question. And I will see you in the next video.